uprising goes into what we might call fads, and each one has a term by which it goes by. So now the latest is reconstruction. And reconstruction is just yet another surreal subject, because we will not reconstruct until a process begins. Or we will reconstruct because, after all, we are aligned with the regime, China, Russia, etc., Iran. But in the final analysis, we sit here and wait. And what are we waiting for? Look at the grand examples of reconstruction that have been led by the West. Take Afghanistan, for example. You know, one surreal story after another. Take Iraq. You know, Iraq has this fascinating story where, in the midst of reconstructing Iraq, they want to have a pipe under the Tigris River. And all the studies tell them they should not do this. It doesn't work. The soil is not compatible. But the company that wants to sell us products, it must create this particular pipe. Because after all, this is what it creates. This is what it manufactures. So after billions of dollars lost, and about 3.5 years of waiting, they finally reached a conclusion which was reached from the very beginning, that they should not have even attempted this. Or take, for another example, at a time in Iraq when unemployment is over 60%, during the so-called reconstruction phase, foreign labor is brought from Eritrea and Ethiopia into Iraq rather than recruiting the local population. These are the grand examples of reconstruction. And yet we wait. We are now yet waiting all over again. In the same vein, we waited for intervention. Now we wait for reconstruction. And even as we are fully aware that when this took place, it does not take place in a manner that is consistent with the best interests of the country at work. So again, we can keep talking about Western policy. In the final analysis, as I tried to summarize to you, it's neither idealist nor is it practical. It's with indifference, because we're not important enough. And for countries that are not important enough, the worst thing you can do, as is now repeating itself yet again in Venezuela, is to believe the type of rhetoric that the West produces. The West would be far more interested in ideas related to terrorism, and in this sense is still willing to coordinate with the very regimes it has categorized as entirely and completely not credible morally. So, to wrap up, there is no Western policy that can be described as a thought-out, systematic approach towards what took place in Syria. And what took place in Syria is predominantly authored by Syrians within. And coming to terms with this reality is the beginning of a real change in what is taking place on the ground and what has been taking place since at least 1963. A tragic political nightmare that has deep roots in a system that is capable easily, by the way, this notion of Assad. You can get rid of Assad easily and you will still have the same system. It's a system with deep roots, with a very specific dynamics. And that's where the story is. And no Western policy will be capable of changing this unless it's changed from within. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. I pass the mic on to you.
There is no mic.
There's no mic.
Yep, there is mic. Thank you for attending this session. And I cannot talk about the Western policies from the point of view of an expert in this field, but I will talk about it as Western policies were perceived by Syrians since the start of the revolution until this point, and how Western policies or the inconsistency of Western policies affected negatively the Syrian society. While I do agree that some of the problems were internally between Syrians themselves, but I argue that a lot of the root of these causes that cause the inconsistency of lack of coordination between Syrians actors could be attributed to the Western policy even from the beginning. So why this topic is important at this very time? Because look at the Syrian case and the Syrian map at the moment, where Syria has now four distinctive territories, one controlled by the regime, another by the Kurds, another by oppositions, and a fourth one by oppositions, but with the presence of the Turkish army. And if you can see the only thing that now allowing to draw boundaries between these territories is the balance between the international powers in the region. Because the region is supported for sure by Russia, Iran, China, and others. The Kurds are supported by the US and the international allies, and the oppositions are supported by Turkey. So at the moment, there is no, Syrians, they have no power to take decisions on the way the crisis evolves. And even a lot of times we hear about discussions happening or the Geneva track and the Stand track, but actually this is only a translation of the international policies towards Syria. And Syrians, they play very limited role to decide on their countries. So that's why it's important to understand, these international policies, and most importantly, the Western ones. And why the Western ones even are more important, not because they have more influence in the region, because now we know that Russia, they have much more influence in the region than the Western countries, but because the aspirations and the values of the Syrian revolution were more in line with the Western values, right? So Syrian people from the beginning, they expected to have more support from the West world or from the US and Europe, because they thought that if we're fighting for freedom, if we're fighting for democracy, then this means that the most powerful nation, the US, because they are selling themselves as the advocates for democracy, then they will support us. But actually this was not the case. And Syrians in the beginning thought that if we documented violations of human rights, war crimes, then this will allow the international community to intervene. But again, this was not the case. But then at a later point, some Syrians, they found that the only way maybe we can ask the Western to intervene is to sell our case or our crises as something that affects their national security. And as was explained, especially by the US, Syria is not being perceived as a major security threat that can affect the US interest. And that's why it was not prioritized. But the problem is about the disconnection between the rhetoric and the actions of the Western countries, and in particular the US. Because since the beginning, there was a lot of temptation among Syrians that the US or the West are pushing us even to demonstrate more. Because looking at the speeches of Obama and Western leaders, you can notice that they delegitimize the Syrian regime since early, maybe 2011 or 2012. But the problem about that was this disconnection between what was said and what was actually implemented. And we all know about the famous red lines of Obama administrations that in real had no sense. And the Syrians, at some point, I remember in August 2013, when the Eastern Ghouta chemical attack took place, I was working at that moment to save the children in the northwest Syria. A lot of people, all of us, we were really shocked by this attack. But in the same time, some people, they had hope. They said, okay, now the Syrian regime, the brutality of the Syrian regime was revealed, and now all the world is watching what's happening, so a change would come. But unfortunately, the approach that the Obama administration decided to approach this incident was very weak and does not fit with the scale of the attack itself. And therefore, at that very moment, the Syrian people, they they identified the importance of linking the Syrian case with the Western security even much more, because it seems that the West, they don't really care about the violations, while yes, sometimes they show some sympathy, but they would not invest in or pushing back the Syrian regime on the basis of these violations itself alone. So that's why the approach was a bit different, and a lot of Syrians, they moved from only talking about democracy and freedom and about the values of the Syrian revolution. They moved to try to document and give more evidence even for these violations. In 2012 and 2013, there were a lot of initiatives like the Violations Documentation Center, the VDC, that is still running till this point, trying to document, because sometimes the West, which I personally, I heard it a lot from some Western leaders in Europe especially, that, you know, yes, we do agree that these violations are happening, but we do not have a real evidence to show to the world or to discuss or to debate in the Security Council. And they said, okay, and in 2013, a lot of Syrian NGOs, they tried to develop even further their documentation and reporting mechanisms to fulfill this kind of lack of evidence, which was not very understandable. But at the same time, we said, okay, we will follow the Western reporting mechanisms. For example, I will talk about attacks on healthcare, because I was involved a lot in this field. In the beginning, Syrian NGOs, they were only reporting this to media, so there was no internal mechanism to report attacks. But then, influenced by the international donors and by the political flavor of Western countries, we said, okay, we will document it in a different way. And there was a lot of coordination with organizations like Physicians for Human Rights and the Human Rights Watch to document systematically and in a verified way these attacks. But this pushed the agenda a little bit, and in 2013, actually in 2012, there was a resolution by the World Health Assembly tasking the World Health Organization to lead the efforts in reporting attacks on healthcare. So this was a real influence, I would say, of what was happening in Syria and elsewhere, but mainly in Syria, because the scale of the attacks on healthcare was massive. So we were able to influence the first step in a policy, right? And the WHO took them 4 years actually to develop this mechanism. So it took them from 2012, when the resolution, which is 65.20 of the World Health Assembly, it took them until late